The smell of a destroyer's engine room at flank speed is specific and unmistakable burnt oil, steam, the metallic bite of superheated metal against your sinuses, in a space where the ambient temperature has been climbing since the throttles went to maximum and shows no sign of stopping. On the morning of October 25th, 1944, off the island of Samar in the Philippine Sea, the men in USS Johnston's forward engine room had been at flank speed long enough that the temperature gauges were reading numbers they had not seen outside of damage control drills, and the sustained bone-deep roar of 60,000 shaft horsepower driving 2,100 tons of destroyer at 36 knots. Was loud enough that communication happened by hand signal, by shouting directly into ears, by the accumulated intuition of men who knew what their ship felt like and could tell from the vibration patterns coming through the deck plates that something was happening on the surface above them that matched nothing in their training. What was happening was this: USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer carrying a crew of 327 men and armed with 5 5-inch guns and 10 torpedoes, was charging at full speed directly toward the largest and most powerful battleship ever built, and the man who had ordered the charge had done so, knowing exactly what the mathematics of the encounter implied. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought across multiple engagements between October 23rd and 26th, 1944, was the largest naval battle in history by virtually every measure: the number of ships involved, the tonnage of warships committed, the geographic area over which the fighting occurred. The specific piece of it that took place off Samar on the morning of October 25th, and that involved Johnston, is known formally as the Battle off Samar, and it occupies a specific position in American naval history that no other engagement quite matches, because what happened there was not a tactically sophisticated maneuver or a well-executed plan. It was an act of collective desperation by a group of men who understood their situation with complete clarity and chose to fight anyway, and the scale of what they achieved in the hours that followed cannot be understood without first understanding how badly the odds were stacked against them. Taffy 3, Task Unit 77.4.3. Its formal designation consisted of 6 small escort carriers, 3 destroyers, including Johnston, and 4 destroyer escorts. The escort carriers were Casablanca-class vessels, built for convoy protection, displacing approximately 7,800 tons and capable of 18 knots. They were not warships in the sense that the term implies offensive combat capability. They were aircraft platforms designed for anti-submarine patrol, close air support, and the delivery of replacement aircraft to fleet carriers. Their armor was minimal. Their defensive armament was limited to a single 5-inch gun on the stern and a battery of 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons. Their crews were not trained for surface action because surface action was not something they were ever expected to conduct. On the morning of October 25th, 1944, at approximately 0646 hours, radar operators aboard the escort carriers detected contacts that their scopes classified initially as American aircraft. The contacts were at approximately 17 miles to the northwest, approaching at speed. Within minutes, the classification was revised. Not aircraft, ships. Many ships. Very large ships, closing at a rate consistent with fleet speeds above 20 knots. At 0658 hours, lookouts aboard Fanshawe Bay, the lead escort carrier, identified the contacts visually. They were Japanese. The masts above the horizon belonged to battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Center Force Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's fleet of 4 battleships, including Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, had transited San Bernardino Strait during the night, evading the American forces that should have been covering the exit, and had found Taffy 3 without air cover, without reinforcement, and without any reasonable means of defense against what was coming toward it. Yamato displaced 72,000 tons. Her main battery was 9 18.1-inch guns, each capable of firing a shell weighing 3,219 pounds to a range of over 26 miles. A single salvo from Yamato's main battery delivered more explosive energy than the total tonnage of USS Johnston. The entire Taffy 3 formation, all ships combined, could not have matched the weight of metal that Center Force could put in the air in a single firing cycle. The encounter was not, by any conventional military calculation, a battle. It was an execution, pending any of several possible interventions, none of them guaranteed. Commander Ernest Evans stood on Johnston's bridge at 6:58 hours and absorbed this information. He was 36 years old, a Cherokee Indian from Muskogee, Oklahoma, a Naval Academy graduate of the class of 1931, and the kind of officer whose relationship to the concept of a tactical retreat was, by the testimony of every man who served under him, essentially non-existent as a personal option. He had commissioned Johnston in October 1943 and had told his crew at that ceremony something they would remember precisely for the rest of their lives, that Johnston would never retreat from an enemy, and that anyone who did not think they could live up to that commitment should transfer off the ship now, while they still could. Nobody transferred. On the morning of October 25, 1944, the promise he had made 13 months earlier became operational in a way that nobody present had fully visualized when he made it. At 07:16 hours, without orders from Taffy 3's commander, without coordination with the other destroyers, without waiting to see what the larger tactical situation might produce in the way of alternatives, Evans announced over Johnston's intercom what they were going to do. The announcement, as recalled by multiple survivors in subsequent interviews and depositions, was brief and unambiguous. He said they were going to make a torpedo attack. He said they would lay smoke to cover the carriers. He told the crew to prepare for the worst. He then rang up flank speed, turned Johnston toward the Japanese formation, and pointed her bow at the center of the largest naval force assembled in the Pacific since the Battle of Midway. The smoke screen that Johnston began laying as she accelerated came from her funnel uptakes and from smoke generators mounted on her stern, a mixture of black funnel exhaust and white chemical smoke that created an opaque wall behind which the escort carriers could attempt to maneuver. The smoke was effective in the specific sense that it obscured the carriers from Japanese gunfire directors for periods of time. It was not effective in the sense that it protected Johnston, which was ahead of the smoke, racing toward the Japanese fleet at 36 knots with her guns already firing. The 5-inch guns on Johnston's forward mounts had opened fire at 07:22 hours, at ranges where their shells could theoretically reach the Japanese cruisers approximately 14,000 yards. The shells from a 5-inch gun weighed 54 pounds. The shells from the heavy cruiser, Kumeno's 8-inch guns, weighed 277 pounds and came back in salvos of 9 rounds. The tactical exchange was not symmetrical. What Johnston's gunfire accomplished in those first minutes was less important than what it forced the Japanese fleet to do. The Japanese heavy cruisers and destroyers in the van of center force were not accustomed to being fired upon by an attacking destroyer at close range while closing at high speed. Their response turning away slightly, presenting their forward batteries, beginning evasive maneuvers was doctrinally correct and tactically predictable, and it bought time. It bought time measured in minutes, not hours. But in the situation developing off Samar on October 25th, minutes were the currency of survival for the escort carriers, and Johnston was spending her own existence to generate them. The torpedo attack came at approximately 7:30 hours. Johnston had closed to within 10,000 yards of the heavy cruiser, Kumano, roughly 5.5 miles, before Evans ordered the torpedo spread launched. 10. Mark 15 torpedoes left the ship in a fan spread across the Japanese cruiser line. The Mark 15 was a steam-powered weapon with a warhead containing approximately 825 pounds of Torpex explosive, running at 45 knots to a maximum range of approximately 15,000 yards. At the range Johnston launched from, the torpedoes took approximately 3 minutes to reach the target zone. 3 minutes is a very long time to be a 2,100-ton destroyer at close range in a gunfight with a Japanese fleet, and Evans used those 3 minutes to turn Johnston away under smoke and begin the series of maneuvers that would occupy the next 2.5 hours of the battle. The torpedo spread hit. 3 torpedoes struck Kumano, blowing off her bow and knocking her out of the battle. 2 more detonated against other cruisers in the formation, further disrupting the Japanese line. From the carriers behind, the men watching through binoculars saw the explosions and the Japanese formation pulling back to assess the damage. For approximately a minute, the relentless pressure of center force's advance was checked. Then the Japanese guns found Johnston. The first hits came at approximately 07:45 hours as Johnston was completing her retirement under smoke. Three 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo struck in rapid succession the forward fire control director, the engine room, the area around the bridge. A 14-inch naval shell weighs 1,485 pounds and travels at approximately 2,600 feet per second. Three of them arriving within seconds of each other on a 2,100-ton ship do not produce minor damage. Johnston lost her forward engine room. She lost power to her aft gun mounts. She lost her gyro compass. She lost her radio transmitter. She lost, for critical minutes, steering control, which was restored only by shifting to manual steering from the emergency tiller position in the ship's stern, a position normally staffed during damage control exercises and now manned by sailors who had trained for this possibility and hoped, in the professional way, that men train for things they hope will never happen, that they would never need it. Evans himself took shrapnel in this initial barrage. He lost 2 fingers from his left hand. He wrapped the hand in cloth and stayed on the bridge. There is no dramatic account of this moment from survivors because the survivors who were near him at the time described it as essentially unremarkable within the context of what was happening around them. The ship was being hit. The captain was still on the bridge. These were both facts, and the second fact was the more operationally significant of the two. The next 45 minutes were the heart of the battle for Johnston's crew, and they were experienced differently depending on where on the ship you were stationed. The men on the bridge and the gun mounts could see something of the tactical situation, the colored shell splashes of Japanese gunfire marking the water around them, the smoke columns from burning carriers in the formation behind them, the enormous silhouettes of Japanese warships visible through gaps in the smoke at distances that shrunk as the engagement continued. The men in the engineering spaces and the damage control parties below decks experienced the same battle as a sequence of impacts and their consequences felt through the hull, heard through the structural groan of steel under explosive stress, measured in the flooding rates that the damage control parties were trying to outpace with portable pumps and wooden plugs, and their own bodies braced against ruptured bulkheads. The damage control parties on Johnston during the engagement were doing work that has no peaceful analogy. When a naval shell strikes a destroyer's hull and detonates inside a compartment, the result is a pressure wave that ruptures every unsecured fitting in the compartment, starts fires from ruptured fuel lines, floods the space through the penetration hole at a rate dependent on the ship's speed and the size of the breach, and kills or wounds every man in the compartment through blast overpressure, fragmentation, or both. The damage control party's job is to enter that compartment after the hit, determine what has happened, fight the fire if there is one, establish what flooding control is possible, shore up the structural members that are compromised, and do all of this while the ship is still maneuvering at whatever speed the remaining propulsion allows, and while additional hits may arrive at any moment. Johnston took additional hits while her damage control parties were working on the damage from the hits before. The men working below decks were doing triage on a patient who kept receiving new wounds. At approximately 08:20 hours, the tactical situation for Taffy 3 reached its worst point. The Japanese formation had closed to ranges at which their guns were achieving regular hits on the escort carriers, one of which, Gambier Bay, was already sinking. The American destroyers and destroyer escorts had been attacking in a rotating sequence, each ship expending its torpedoes and then continuing to fight with guns before retiring to lay more smoke. But the tempo of the Japanese advance had not been broken, only slowed. Johnston, already severely damaged with one engine room destroyed and multiple gun mounts out of action, was still firing. The forward guns were operating intermittently, dependent on the unreliable power supply from the surviving engine room. The gun crews were loading and firing manually when the power failed to the hoists, carrying shells by hand from the handling rooms below. The torpedo magazine was empty. Johnston had nothing left to fire at the Japanese ships except her 5-inch guns, and whatever time remained to her as a functioning weapons platform, and she was using both with the deliberate efficiency of men who understood that they had no other option and had made their peace with what that implied. Survivors' accounts of Johnston's final hour converge on specific details, with the consistency that characterizes traumatic memory, the things that burned into the consciousness because they were impossible to process at the time, and remained impossible to process for years afterward. The The colored shell splashes around the ship. Japanese ranging procedure used dye-marked shells so observers could identify which ship's fire was hitting, and the water around Johnston was marked in multiple colors by the last hour, indicating that multiple Japanese ships were targeting her simultaneously. The sound of hits arriving faster than the previous hits, the intervals between them compressing as the Japanese formation closed, the fires visible from the bridge in the after section of the ship, the men on the aft gun mounts continuing to load and fire, while water was visibly rising around the base of the mount. Commander Evans had been wounded again in the later stages of the battle. He had been blown off the bridge by a hit and had made his way back to a position from which he could still direct the ship's movements. He was reportedly communicating through a megaphone by the final phase of the action, his voice carrying over the noise of the battle to the men at the manual steering position in the stern, because the intercom system had long since been destroyed. This detail, the captain of a fatally wounded destroyer shouting steering commands through a megaphone while his ship absorbed hits from a fleet that should not have been fought at all, is the detail that resists any framing that makes it less than what it actually was. It was a man doing his job, past the point at which doing his job was survivable because stopping was not something he was able to bring himself to do. At approximately 09:45 hours, Johnston was dead in the water. Both engine rooms had been knocked out. She had taken an estimated 20 hits from large-caliber shells and perhaps 40 additional hits from smaller-caliber weapons during the course of the engagement. Her hull was intact below the waterline in a technical sense. She had not been holed to the point of immediate uncontrolled flooding, but the fires burning in multiple compartments and the progressive flooding from accumulated damage had brought her to a condition from which no amount of damage control could produce a survivable outcome. Evans gave the order to abandon ship. The crew went into the water. The water temperature off Samar on October 25, 1944, was approximately 85 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to prevent rapid hypothermia, which was the only advantage the men in the water had over the crew of any ship that had sunk in the North Atlantic during the same war. Warm water does not prevent exhaustion. It does not prevent shark attack. It does not provide any flotation beyond what a life jacket delivers, and life jackets on a ship that has been in extended combat and taken multiple hits are not always in the condition that they should be in when needed. Evans himself was in the water. He was seen by multiple survivors, wounded, attempting to remain afloat. He was not among the men who were recovered. Johnston sank at approximately 10 hours on October 25, 1944. She had been in the battle for approximately 2.5 hours. She had expended all of her torpedoes and essentially all of her ammunition. She had made torpedo attacks, gun attacks, and smoke-laying runs throughout a battle in which she was outweighed, outgunned, and outranged by every ship in the opposing fleet by margins that no tactical skill could overcome, and that only the specific geography of the engagement, the smoke, the rain squalls, the confusion generated by the persistent American attacks had prevented from producing an instantaneous result. She had been struck so many times and by such heavy ordnance that post-war analysis could not determine with certainty how many hits she had taken, only that the number was substantially higher than the structural damage models for a Fletcher-class destroyer were designed to contemplate. Before Johnston sank, something happened that has been documented by multiple survivors and confirmed through post-war Japanese records. As the ship settled lower and the crew was in the water, a Japanese destroyer that had been among Johnston's pursuers came alongside. The Japanese captain, whose identity has never been definitively established, though the ship was likely one of the destroyers from Desron, was seen on his bridge as he passed the sinking Johnston. He saluted. In some accounts, the gesture is described as a bow. The specifics of the gesture's form have been debated by historians, but not its occurrence, which is documented in the accounts of survivors who were in the water near the ship as it sank and who watched the Japanese vessel pass. The Japanese captain acknowledged what Johnston had done in the only way available to him at that moment, which was the gesture of one professional naval officer toward another, made across the specific and unbridgeable distance that combat establishes between men who are trying to kill each other. Of Johnston's crew of 327 men, 141 survived. 186 died, some in the battle itself, from direct hits and their consequences, and some in the water during the approximately 50 hours between Johnston's sinking and the arrival of rescue vessels. The men in the water during those 50 hours had life jackets. They had each other. And they had the warm Philippine seawater that prevented hypothermia while providing no other assistance. They also had sharks, which took men from the groups in the water over the course of those 50 hours in the specific awful way that open ocean shark predation works not in the dramatic form that the popular imagination tends to picture, but in the sustained, incremental, brutal form that men who survived the Indianapolis later described with the particular flatness of accounts that have been processed past the point where emotional language can add anything to them. The 186 men who died included Commander Ernest Evans, who received the Medal of Honor, posthumously the citation, describing his actions in language that is the official Navy's attempt to translate what he did into the vocabulary of military decoration, which is itself a translation that loses most of what it is translating. The citation notes his aggressive tactics and his inspiring leadership and the damage his ship inflicted on a numerically superior enemy force. These are true statements. They are also insufficient statements because the facts they describe are the product of a decision that no military doctrine requires and that no training manual specifies as the correct response to the situation Evans faced on the morning of October 25, 1944. The official doctrine, in the situation that confronted Taffy 3, called for smoke and evasion while calling for help from forces that might provide it. This is the correct doctrine. This is what a reasonable man following established procedures would have done. Evans did not do it because Evans was not, in the specific moment the Japanese fleet appeared on his radar, calculating his options against a doctrinal framework. He was calculating them against a commitment he had made to his crew 13 months earlier on the day they commissioned the ship. And the commitment was simpler than doctrine and did not contain a clause that said, "except when the odds are prohibitive." What Johnston's charge and the subsequent 2.5 hours of fighting actually accomplished in the tactical sense is a question that naval historians have examined from multiple angles. The most defensible conclusion is that the attacks by Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, and the simultaneous attacks by the destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond, combined with the air attacks launched from the escort carrier's aircraft, produced enough disruption of Center Force's cohesion and command that Vice Admiral Kurita, faced with an engagement that was consuming his ships faster than his intelligence picture explained, and that showed no sign of ending, made the decision to withdraw. He withdrew at approximately 9:12 hours, 2 hours, and 15 minutes into the battle, with the escort carriers of Taffy, 3 still afloat, and the invasion beaches of Leyte Gulf, which Center Force had been sent to destroy, still intact behind them. Kurita's decision to withdraw has been argued over ever since, and the argument will not be resolved here. What is not arguable is the outcome. The beachhead held, the invasion continued, the Philippines were liberated on the schedule that MacArthur's plan required, and the destruction of Japanese air power and naval power in the Leyte Gulf engagements removed any realistic prospect that Japan could contest the subsequent American advance toward the home islands. The strategic consequence of Taffy 3's survival was not small. It was purchased at the price that the men of Johnston and Hull and Samuel B. Roberts paid, and it is worth being specific about what that price consisted of, because the abstractions of strategic consequence tend to absorb the specific realities of what those ships and those men actually experienced in the water, and on the burning decks, and in the flooded compartments of the hours between 6:58 and 10:10 on October 25, 1944. Machinist's mate, second-class Vaughn Merchant, was in Johnston's after-engine room when the first hits arrived. His account, given to Navy investigators in 1944, and preserved in the action report files at the National Archives, describes what happened in the engineering spaces with the precision of a man trained to observe machinery and report its status. He describes the first hit as a physical impact felt through the deck plates before the sound arrived. The pressure wave of the explosion propagating through the steel structure of the ship faster than the acoustic wave through the air. He describes the steamline rupture that followed the superheated steam that filled the space at temperatures above 600 degrees Fahrenheit, the sound it made, the way the men in the space moved away from it by instinct, without needing to understand what was happening before moving. He describes getting out of the space through the escape hatch and finding himself on the deck in the middle of a battle he could only partially see, and had no direct means of influencing, and then finding his way to a damage control party and spending the next hour doing the work that damage control parties do on ships that are being continuously hit. Merchant survived. He was among the 141 recovered from the water after 50 hours. His account of those 50 hours is brief. He told the investigators that he did not think there was anything useful he could add to what they would learn from the other survivors about the time in the water, and the investigators noted this response without pressing it further. He returned to the United States and was discharged from the Navy in 1946. He lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, until his death in 1987. His daughter donated his service records, his action report transcript, and a single photograph of Johnston at sea, taken sometime in 1944, the ship at speed in bright Pacific sunlight, her bow wave white against the blue water, to the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, where they are held in the archives. The photograph is not on display. The National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, sits in a town of approximately 12,000 people, 90 miles west of Austin in the Texas Hill Country. The museum occupies several buildings and covers the Pacific War comprehensively. The early campaigns, the turning points, the island-hopping advance, the strategic bombing of Japan. The Johnston exhibit includes photographs, a scale model, and text panels describing the battle. On a typical weekday, a visitor can walk through the exhibit in approximately 15 minutes. The museum is excellent, the exhibit is accurate. 15 minutes is not very long. Johnston displaced 2,100 tons. She was built in Seattle in 1943. She had 5 guns, 10 torpedo tubes, and 2 engine rooms that could drive her at 36 knots. She was designed to fight and was expected to be expended in combat if the situation required it. She cost approximately $7.5 million to build in 1943 dollars. She lasted 2.5 hours against a fleet that should have destroyed her in 10 minutes. And the 186 men who died on her and in the water beside her were between the ages of 17 and 36, and most of them are not remembered by name outside of the families that carry the memory, and the photograph in the Fredericksburg archives is not on display.